Gracias a todos a la conferencia de hoy que cierra el ciclo dedicado a Paolo Veronese con motivo de la exposición. Es para mí un placer presentar al conferenciante de hoy, Giorgio Tagliaferro. Yo creo que nos conocimos en el año 2003 cuando hicimos la exposición de Tiziano y conocí a la entonces muy joven Giorgio Tagliaferro, que estaba completando su tesis doctoral por la Universidad Ca' Foscari en Venecia. Después ha tenido una vida profesional tanto en Italia como, ahora lo estábamos comentando, en el Reino Unido, y es de hecho el catedrático y director del Departamento de Arte de la Universidad de Warwick. Es alguien que ha dedicado toda su vida a la pintura veneciana del siglo XVI, a los grandes nombres de la pintura veneciana. Me gustaría destacar particularmente su extraordinaria contribución en un libro colectivo, pero del cual era el autor de prácticamente todo el volumen, que era Le botteghe di Tiziano, que es un libro que les recomiendo encarecidamente. Y más recientemente ha editado un volumen dedicado a Tintoretto Identity, Practice and Meaning. Y es miembro fundador de la Venetian Art History Research Group, con sede en el Reino Unido, que trata de incentivar el estudio del arte veneciano del siglo XVI. Así que nada más, darle la bienvenida y les dejo con ellos y la conferencia titulada Veronés y la nueva imagen imperial en Venecia. Gracias.
Okay. Buenas tardes, un saludo a todos los presentes y gracias por venir. Quiero agradecer al director de Prado, Miguel Falomir, por su invitación y felicitarlo por esta importante exposición de Veronés. Y también agradezco a su equipo por la organización de esta conferencia. El español es un idioma muy hermoso, precisamente por esta razón voy a ahorrarles el tormento de oírme arruinándolo y cambiaré al inglés ahora mismo. In 1629, Peter Paul Rubens was commissioned by King Charles I to decorate the ceiling of the banqueting hall at Whitehall Palace in London with a series of paintings commemorating Charles's late father and predecessor James, the first to unite the crowns of England, Ireland, and Scotland. The program was conceived as a glorification of the House of Stuart, focusing on a notion of absolutist sovereignty, where the monarch is presented as answerable to God alone. In the central depiction of his apotheosis, James I is elevated to a quasi-divine realm. Dressed in regal robes and holding a scepter, he is carried up to heaven by Jupiter's eagle, clutching the thunderbolt that alludes to the ancient god of the gods. The king is bestowed upon the badges of his authority, the crown and orb, borne by flying putters, and further above, a laurel wreath simultaneously held by a winged Victory and by Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. A host of flying putters play a celestial music, while other figures at the bottom, justice on the right, piety and religion on the left, accompany the king. These personifications embody both the sovereign's virtues and the positive effects that these produce to the benefit of the subjects, thus associating the authority symbolized by the regal insignia with the superior ethical conduct worthy of a monarch. And in this way, the political theme is channeled into the moral sphere. A similar mechanism is in place in the wise reign of James I. On the right, Minerva, the peacemaker warrior, scourges Mars, the god of war, with a thunderbolt, while at the bottom left, Mercury, here present as god of eloquence, weaponizes his caduceus, the staff entwined with two snakes and topped with wings, to slay the lying figure of Fury. The caduceus was an established symbol of peaceful wisdom. Just above Mercury, the embracing figures of plenty and peace show the effects deriving from the protective action of the king against the threats of war and violence. The king is sitting at the center and honored again with the crown and the laurel wreath. And more than the characters populating this scene, it is the way they are arranged in the picture that communicates the wise and peaceful authority of the king. The space is entirely defined by an architectural structure inspired by antiquity and characterized by 4 sturdy helical columns, a type that, because it had been famously employed by Solomon in the Temple of Jerusalem as described in the Bible, was traditionally associated with just, wise, and pious rule, of which Solomon was considered the perfect model. Rubens conceived a layout for his pictures that accommodates the difficult viewing conditions of a ceiling decoration by presenting the viewer with a composition that is at the same time frontal and ascensional. While the foreshortening of the figures is reduced, sky and architecture are ingeniously exploited to suggest upward movement and established clear distinctions between high and low, thereby creating a sense of hierarchy that signifies superiority, supremacy, and triumph. The result is clear, legible, immediate. It's an image of absolutist power, one displaying a divinely chosen monarch who embodies and controls rulership over the subjects. As in these images, James is the visual hinge around which all the other figures pivot, so in real life, he was the sole sovereign around whom all political and social bodies revolved. The reason why I chose to dwell on these images to introduce the topic of this lecture is that Rubens, in creating his designs, drew extensively on Veronese. The architectural structure propped against the sky, with Solomonic columns framing the majestic figure of Venice in regal robes and with a scepter in her hand, crowned by a victory and surrounded by other personifications, which you see in this painting in the Doge's Palace, resonates in both of Rubens's paintings celebrating James as the sole and only king. The focus on the investiture of the main protagonist, the preponderance of female characters, but also the insignia and symbols of rulership, and the link established between the figures through their gazing and gesturing, reveal close analogies. We can draw a comparison between the presence of the crown borne above James's head on the one hand and offered to Venice on the other, as well as between the caduceus, depicted in both cases in proximity of the crown itself, which is the same instrument in the hands of Mercury that we had seen in the previous image. Veronese was commissioned this painting after a fire in 1577 had devastated the room in the Doge's Palace where the Great Council, the assembly that comprised all the adult Venetian noblemen and constituted the basis of the Venetian government, used to gather. The new painting program, a mix of scenes depicting the past heroic endeavors of the Venetians over a span of 8 centuries and allegories, culminated in this apotheosis of Venice dispensing happiness to her subjects. Veronese put his pictorial intelligence in the service of the Venetian government to develop a representation of power that was, both for its visual efficacy and semantic complexity, unprecedented. It was so spectacular that when Rubens 40 decades later was asked to glorify the English monarchy, he resorted to the sketches that he had surely taken after Veronese during one of his trips to Venice in the early 1600s. If we think in terms of an artist being inspired by another artist, this is just fine. But if we consider that the Republic of Venice consisted in a collective government based on principles of equality between citizens, or at least between those who form the ruling class, that is the opposite to absolute monarchy, which rested on the rule of a single individual without any superior authority aside from God, well, then some questions arise as to the similarities between these images. In fact, how can a representation of republican authority be suitable or even inform an image of absolutist monarchy? And let me show, just go back here, which is much better. Which more generally raises the question as to how political authority is shaped by its own representation, and to what extent the visual arts can contribute to the understanding of both a polity and the authority it has. And finally, because our focus today is on one artist in particular, we should also question whether and to what extent artists can impact on the communication and perception of power. A key preliminary point to make is that the images under examination are not political constructs per se, but mediations between political ideals and political reality, aimed at visualizing and communicating a projection of what the rulers wanted their rule to appear like. In that respect, these pictures reflect only partially an actual state of things, whereas they convey also, to a large extent, ideological concepts underlying and surrounding the political practice of a given government. In a nutshell, these images stage sovereignty rather than depict a form of government, and they do so more specifically in the form of an apotheosis that exalts absolute power, regardless of whether this refers to a single ruler or to a group of people. It is probably no coincidence that they were created respectively when the notion of sovereignty had just been articulated for the first time by Jean Bodin in France in the 1570s, and in the years preceding Thomas Hobbes's further development of the concept of sovereignty during the English Civil War, which would have led to Charles I's decapitation. However, I have no time today to try to explain the historical reasons why these images appeared to a specific time in history. Instead, I shall aim to clarify the political and cultural implications of Veronese's representations of the Venetian government staged in the Doge's palace. At all events, I won't discuss all the paintings Veronese made for the Doge's palace, but focus only on 3 groups of works that encapsulate the originality and complexity of his pictorial genius. As a preliminary point, I should clarify that when we refer to Venice as a republic, this must be understood as one informed by an aristocratic mindset. In Venice, sovereignty lay not in a dynastic prince, but in the patriciate as a whole body, the aristocracy. Over the centuries, the right to participate in public life evolved into political primacy and became a criterion of aristocratic status and identity. The nobleman had exclusive access to the administrative and political roles of the government. It was the patricians who administered justice through central councils and law courts located in the Doge's palace. Those patricians who were sent to administer the subject territories acted as supreme representatives of Venetian justice within the state. Though they were assisted by local jurists, they were the judges, and referred back to Venice, which retained the ultimate legal authority. Therefore, we can conclude that the aristocracy overlapped and identified itself with the government, and it was precisely the aristocratic nature of the Venetian power that created a legal separateness between Venice and its subject territories. And you see here the Great Council gathered in the room that I mentioned with Veronese's painting above. But the nice image here shows you how it would appear with the people inside in their functions. Despite the collective nature of this political authority, Venice had its nominal prince, the Doge, who was elected among the patriciate by his peers. His role over the centuries turned from one of military and political leader to that of a figurehead who embodied the sovereignty and dignity of the republic rather than exerting political influence. This was certainly the case throughout the 16th century and in Veronese's time. However, notwithstanding these limitations, the Doge retained an aura of sacredness that made of him a living manifestation of the pseudo-regal dignity that the Republic claimed. This sort of mystical authority was expressed by the Doge's robes, the ermine cape and the brocaded cloak, his distinctive horn-shaped cap, and the insignia like the umbrella, sword, or white candle visible here, which were carried by the Doge's retinue and displayed publicly during the processions regularly performed throughout the city, streets, and squares. The Venetian patriciate promoted a rich rhetoric of power, both visual and written, that compensated for the lack of proper political theory. They availed themselves of artists and humanists to present their political identity in allegorized terms, as testified to, for instance, by the development of a personification of Venice that identified with justice and also with the Virgin Mary. I shall briefly expound this through 3 examples. The first one you see is Filippo Calendario's Tondo on one of the external facades of the Doge's palace, where a female figure displays 2 typical attributes of justice: the sword and the lions forming a throne on which she is sitting, which refer to Solomon's throne as described in the Bible. However, this figure is identified as Venice by an inscription, Venetia, while the scroll she holds in her proper left hand celebrates her treading over the furies of the sea beneath her feet. The second example here, Venice was traditionally said to have been founded on the day of the Annunciation, the 25th of March of the year 421, thus signaling that Venice was conceived in God's mind and predestined to defend and look after her people and the Christianity. This painting from the early 16th century refers exactly to this foundational myth in setting Mary's Annunciation in St. Mark's Square, the political and religious center of the city. Finally, this painting that celebrates the first millennium of Venice, according to the above-mentioned legend, so painted in 1421, displays again the figure of justice at the center, holding her traditional attributes, the sword and scales with which she judges, and sitting on Solomon's throne, flanked by the archangels Gabriel on the right and Michael on the left. The scrolls explicitly identify justice as Venice, and while Gabriel, the angel of the Annunciation, through his scroll exhorts Venice to lead humanity through the darkness, Michael, the angel of the Last Judgment, implores her to distribute awards and punishments according to merit. Venice herself states that she will heed the warnings of the angels and the holy scriptures and be gentle to the pious, hostile to the wicked, and disdainful of the proud. So between the archangels, Venice is at the same time justice and Mary. These images present Venice as just and pious, directly inspired by God, a morally superior entity that guides her citizens towards salvation. This is in harmony with the patrician sense of divine in relation to the administration of law, which they based on ethical religious ideals such as justice or equity, rather than on human law, the written law. Crime was deemed as an offense to God rather than an infringement of the statutes. Justice was a matter of piety based on a behavioral model shaped around the ideal of the virtuous ancestors from whom the patricians descended. This was understood not in terms of following a legal precedent, but rather as the application of universal principles inherited from the past. The intentions of an individual were deemed crucial to express judgment. So judgment was a matter of conscience, not of judicial code. In conclusion, a key principle to bear in mind is that the notion of justice was embedded in the Venetian concept of government, which was interpreted in moral terms in the first instance, therefore was seen through the lenses of Christian ethics. Veronese complicated this tradition with his inventions for the decorations of various rooms in the Doge's palace. As mentioned, I shall focus on 3 groups of works, beginning with this one. The Council of Ten was a small body formed of only 10 people that controlled state security, acting as a tribunal for political crimes. During the 16th century, it gained increased political power and became able to overrule the decisions of other governmental bodies in relation to legal, military, and diplomatic matters. It was meant to preserve the stability of the government against corruption or overthrow. Citizens accused of a crime against the state were summoned in that room that you see here to be heard by the council. And you wouldn't like to be there, I'm sure. The ceiling just above their heads, therefore, would have conveyed the sense of severe authority that the council embodied. And Veronese, who was commissioned to paint it in the early 1550s, along with 2 other artists, interpreted this message in an original, persuasive way, as demonstrated in the 2 paintings highlighted here. This picture is taken from the viewpoint of a defendant facing the council board. What you see is a 19th century copy that was installed after Napoleon moved the original painting to the Louvre Museum. It still gives you a sense of how Veronese conceived the painting, placed at the very center of the ceiling in relation to the setting and the actual viewer. Jupiter glides through the canvas, performing a movement parallel to the ceiling surface, giving the impression of entering the painting from another space, to chastise the vices with his thunderbolt. If I show you the painting frontally, you will see that the spatial relationships between the figures are much more complex. Jupiter is plummeting from an upward position to throw down the vices, drawing a top-down vertical axis. Moreover, he is positioned slightly backwards, deeper in the back of this aerial space, while the vices are nearer to us. This means the vices weren't able to climb up to the celestial sphere where Jupiter comes from, thus reinforcing the image of strength and inaccessibility that Jupiter expresses. Clearly, the God of gods is an avatar for the Council of Ten. Therefore, the image depicts the council's unmovable determination to watch over the moral integrity of the country. Another thing to notice is that Jupiter's thunderbolt, which is, as seen before, his typical attribute, is here transformed into a weapon the god uses to perform his action. Rather than a means to identify him, the thunderbolt becomes a metaphor of the authority exerted by the council. Conversely, the vices are only vaguely defined, maybe alluding to adultery, the half-dressed couple, and forgery, the man at the bottom grasping a bunch of coins. But what matters, apparently, is less who they are, but rather the fact they are being slain and repelled. The image visualizes the principle of justice embodied and guaranteed by the council by displaying a thwarted attempt to subvert authority. Before Veronese, Giulio Romano in Palazzo Tet Mantua had represented the conflict between good and evil through an illusionistic display of the story of Jupiter vanquishing the giants who attempt to topple the Olympian gods, obviously alluding to the uncontested authority of the Duke of Mantua. But Giulio Romano transformed the whole room into this sort of illusionistic depiction. One final detail deserves attention. At an intermediate position between Jupiter and the vices, an angel holding a large book looks down to the falling vices. Whether the book stands for the Bible or for a code of laws, I'm not able to tell. At all events, this ambiguous overlapping of pagan and Christian iconography signifies that the council is divinely inspired, reflecting the sense of divine that, as I mentioned before, underpinned the Venetians' administration of justice. This sense of divine justice is encapsulated by this painting that Veronese made for the adjacent antechamber where Saint Mark crowns the virtues. Saint Mark was the patron of both Venice and the Republic, which was called Republic of Saint Mark. Here the saint stands for the government and rewards with a crown the three theological virtues below him: faith, hope, and charity. The message is informed by the sense of moral and religious behavior that lay at the core of Venetian politics, which I just mentioned. Again, it is the structure of the image that constructs meaning. The crown is at the very center, at the intersection of the diagonals of the pictorial surface. The virtues' raised arms express elevation, reinforcing the meaning of the crown as symbol of a superior moral status. The picture reverses the repulsion of the vices in the previous painting. If their corruption is pushed down, here righteousness is taken up. In conclusion, we see in these two paintings the overlapping of the political and moral spheres, which, as you may remember, is what Rubens realized in the celebration of James Stewart. Finally, in this other painting for the Council of Ten, Veronese conceived a new image of the personification of Venice that is much more elaborate than the one we have seen before. Here Venice is a young, dignified woman with the same complexion as the virtues in the previous painting, and like the virtues, she gazes up and raises her arm to receive various insignia from a female figure hovering above, who pulls out her gifts from a horn of plenty, the so-called cornucopia. It is not easy to identify this woman, maybe a personification of prosperity, but what matters is that, as much as Saint Mark in the other painting, she belongs to a superior sphere indicated by the sky. Venice underneath is rewarded in the same way the virtues are, suggesting that she is recompensed for her righteous behavior. When we look closely at the gifts, we realize this is at the same time an image of prosperity and an investiture. Along with coins and jewels, Venice receives a laurel wreath, a crown, and a ducal cap, all of which signify her authority and regal status. Venice, who has a scepter in her hand and is accompanied by the winged lion of Saint Mark, is like a queen. Her moral elevation is at the same time a bestowing of power upon her. Last but not least, she sits on a globe, a motif inspired by the ancient allegory of Rome, Italy, which was well known through Roman coins in the 16th century. The globe signals universal authority and divine sanction. Here, the storied globe of the celestial vault seen in ancient coins is transformed into terrestrial globe, indicating Venice's recognized power in the world. The fact the motif of the cornucopia borne by the figure of Italy in the ancient coin is transferred onto Veronese's painting suggests a deliberate intention to refer to the ancient prototype. In conclusion, this is an image of legitimation and elevation that precedes, at least in its structural concept, the later representation of James's elevation, and see the double motif of the laurel wreath and crown. Veronese would later develop this theme into a much more complex apparatus when he was commissioned the new decoration of the Sala del Collegio in the Doge's Palace after it was ravaged by a fire in 1574, which is a different fire from the one of 1577. This is the room where the full college met. The college was a body of 16 people comprising the Doge, his councilors, representatives of the Supreme Court, and the principal policy-making officials of the state. This is also the place where the foreign ambassadors and delegates of the subject territories were officially received, meaning that it was the place where the dominant government materialized in front of the subjects. Accordingly, Veronese and his patrons conceived for the ceiling an imposing decoration explicitly made to impress and convey a sense of firm and strong power. While at the sides are personifications of virtues with symbols that should now be more familiar to you, like the cornucopia and the caduceus, the central row displays three political allegories that form a bold and unprecedented statement of absolute sovereignty, which I shall now discuss. I'll start with the first allegory, which shows the authority over the subject territories. The inscription on the left in the octagon in Latin means the strength of the dominion, where the term dominion, imperium in Latin, means both dominance, power, and dominion, state, the actual territorial state. Mars and Neptune stand for the mainland and maritime states that form the Venetian state. One was the stretch of lands in the region adjacent to Venice. The other was the coastal and island outposts in the eastern Mediterranean between current Slovenia, Croatia, Albania, and Greece. The maritime state was time-honored and traditionally associated by the Venetians with their seafaring and trade. The mainland state was more recent, following the acquisition of a large expanse of land in northern Italy in the 15th century. The same figures of Mars and Neptune are depicted in sculpture on the staircase that the doges ascended to when they to be crowned after their elections. It's in the shape of a Roman triumphal arch, as you can see, and the three figures that you see here represent the mainland states, Mars, Neptune, the maritime state, and then the Lion of Saint Mark, the winged lion, stands for the Republic of Venice. And this was a common symbol that you would find not just in Venice, but also in the subject towns. And this painted by Carpaccio shows the lion with his paws in the sea, the rear paws, and the front paws on the land, meaning the unification in sense of maritime and mainland state. So overall, the painting means sovereignty in terms of territorial unity, the state, and it's characterized as strong, as we said. The second allegory shows a scene of sacrifice at the bottom, where the priest looks like any priest described in the Old Testament. He's not a Christian priest. You can see a lamb taken to the sacrifice, and you can see that fire is burned here. And this is, again, not Christian, but it's recalls the Old Testament. And then the smoke created by the burning fire becomes transforms into the clouds on which this figure is sitting. This figure has a chalice, and this is obviously a Christian chalice. So that's the figure of Christian faith. So the motif here is the traditional motif of the Mosaic law of the Old Testament turned into Christian grace through the transformation of sacrifice at the bottom from an outward ceremony, with the animal killing included, into an inward ritual where Christ is the symbolical lamb to be internalized through the communion. And I suppose the majority of you are familiar with this concept. So in the end, what this means is an idea of self-sacrifice, which is implied in Christ self-sacrificing for the salvation of humankind. Interestingly, the donor's crest, three different families of the three donors of this painting, are these guys in the offerings, which suggests that the three donors participate in this kind of, in the offering, in this sacrifice. So as patricians, with their roles in the administration and the government, they're showing that they participate in this idea of sacrifice and of self-sacrifice. So that explains these inscriptions. The one to the left, Republica Fundamentum, means the foundation of the state, and it's at the bottom, refers to the sacrifice. So sacrifice, piety, and the actual looking after cults is part of is at the foundation of the state. Whereas nunquam de relicta, never abandoned, refers to Christian faith. And I will say more about the meaning of this. What are the historical circumstances for this? So this is not just a painting about piety. This is about promoting and looking after religious cult as foundational for a state. And that implies the jurisdiction over the local church. And I should remind that the Venetians were very jealous about appointing their own bishops as opposed to the Roman church. And it's also about protection over Christian faith. So more general, this is a painting that connects with what I said before about the law being based on divine or ethical religious ideals. So the painting has to be understood as an allegory of sovereignty in terms of a mystique of power. So the government here is presented as a mystical body, which is what I mentioned already with reference to the Doge. But here it's extended to the whole idea of the state and sovereignty. In the third allegory, Venice is sitting on a throne with peace and justice, which is a traditional duo associated with good government, and the winged lion of Saint Mark. The inscription, Custodes Libertatis, means guardians of liberty, is the theme of Venice's liberty, the original liberty of Venice, the Venetians boasted. And it's liberty here intended in a twofold meaning of as both sovereignty, on the one hand, so the freedom from external domination of another state, and on the other hand, as self-rule, the freedom from internal domination of a single ruler, as a republic. So the patriciate claimed that Venice had always been free in both senses. And you see it reflected here. The question is whether the inscriptions, the guardians, refer to all three figures altogether or the Venetian patricians as a whole. It's an open question. What is interesting is that Venice as a queen echoes the figure of the Doge. See the ducal robes, the crown, the scepter, but think about the real presence of the Doge in the room and the connection between the living image of the Doge and the painted image just above of Venice as a queen. So sovereignty here is, in terms of moral integrity, superior status, producing good effects on the citizens like peace and justice. But there's also an added value contained in a detail that is usually overseen, which is the top of the scepter in the form of a cross. And this is typically an imperial attribute. Only the emperors or the kings that wanted to display themselves as emperor with an imperial power, like Elizabeth of England, for instance, these were the only ones who would display a cross. So how do we explain that? What does that mean? Well, we need to look at the painting on the end wall, just underneath this picture, which was painted by Veronese and represents it's a commemorative painting of the Doge Sebastiano Venier, who was elected Doge years after, leading the Venetians in the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571, which is when the Venetians especially claimed that they led I know that here in Spain I shouldn't say that, but that's what they claimed, that they were the ones who brought the Holy League to overcome the Ottomans in this famous naval victory, which was an epochal event that was saluted as symbolical victory of Christendom over the infidels, which is how the Ottomans were seen and presented for propaganda reasons. So the Ottomans become some sort of metaphysical enemy that threatens Christianity. And the Venetians, especially leading the Holy League, present themselves as the liberators. So that's why when I say guardians of liberty, who are we referring to? The kneeling Doge is introduced by Saint Mark. So this is the Doge, this is Saint Mark, patron saint of Venice at the end of the Republic, to Saint Justina, patron saint of the battle, which was fought on her feast day, the 7th of October, blessed by Christ the Savior, who is shown here as the Redeemer after his sacrifice, with a retinue of pages on the right, and most especially Venice holding a cap. This is a fantastic painting because it shows you the ability Veronese had in linking figures through their theatrical gesturing and also the gazing. The scene is introduced, though, by this figure, Faith. Seen from the rear on the foreground left with the Battle of Lepanto depicted in the background, she offers the Eucharistic chalice to Christ, laying stress on the notion of Christian sacrifice, and connects with faith in the central ceiling allegory that we have seen, and therefore sheds more light on the whole ceiling decoration, meaning that the Venetian self-denial demonstrated by the heroes of Lepanto, willing to die to defend not just their country but the whole Christendom, is what justifies that representation. So never abandon saint descriptions. Why? Because of Lepanto. And here you can see why we have a cross-topped scepter, because it connects visually with Christ's orb, symbol of the universality of his redemption. So Venice is the custodian of liberty, not just for her subjects, but for the whole Christendom. So it's an imperial message in Christian terms. And along these lines, Venier is presented as both the Doge, see the cloak, the mantle, and the soldier, see the armor. But in this particular context, it appears clear that he is ideally connoted as a soldier of Christ. Miles Christianos was the expression used at that time. So it's the imperial notion of a prince as a defender of peace and faith that Charles V, and the painting that I'm sure you're very familiar with, propagated in the 16th century, presenting himself as a Miles Christianus and as a new Augustus. And Augustus was the Roman emperor who became model of imperial authority in Christianized terms. So the imperial idea of sovereignty is virtually extended to the Doge in this painting, and it's just a rhetorical image, of course, doesn't reflect the actual power of the Doge, but fits the ideal of selfless rule that underpins the mindset of the patriciate. And accordingly, Saint Justina and Venice in the picture are kind of interchangeable. I mean, Justina on the left looks like Venice like a princess, but has the knife and palm branch of her martyrdom, whereas Venice on the right has the ducal cap that connotes as Venice, but has a halo, a golden halo, like a saint, like Saint Justina. So the two themes of sacrifice embodied by Justina and sovereignty embodied by Venice with her ducal cap. They are intertwined here, and like in the ceiling, self-denial is both intended in Republican and Christian terms. Literally, is the willingness to shed one's own blood to defend faith and liberty. So the sovereignty embodied by Venice rests not only on territorial dominion, but also on moral superiority, on virtue ethics that imply commitment and preparedness to fight to the death for the sake of Christ and of the country. So the change between Justina and Venice, I believe, resulted from a last-minute change. We have a preparatory drawing that shows Sebastiano Venier in front of Venice, not Justina, and Justina just in the back. And some people believe that this is because there was too much emphasis on the Doge, whereas I don't believe that's the problem. That wouldn't be a problem because all other paintings in the same room show the Doge in a kind of similar way. But what you have here actually is the reference to sacrifice. But Sebastiano Venier didn't die. He didn't die in the battle. This guy instead, who is in the background, in profile, between the cloud, and added at the last minute, died. He was the admiral. His name was Agostino Barbarigo. And you see him here, depicted by Veronese, with an arrow in his hand. It's the arrow that was struck in his eye, and he died because of that, just 4 days after the battle. So he's the hero. He's a saint. And he, like Saint Sebastian in his famous painting by Veronese, showing to Diocletian, his persecutor, one of the arrows that were struck to him in an attempt to kill him, which didn't happen because he was saved in a divine way. So it's exactly the same gestures. So here, this is postmortem, clearly, portrait. Agostino Barbarigo, one of the heroes of Lepanto, becomes like a saint. And you can see that his image then was propagated also through prints. And these prints, interestingly, matches these other prints of, again, Sebastiano Vernier, but also the Doge, Alvise Mocenigo, who didn't fight in the battle. So why is he represented like a warrior and celebrated as as victorious at Lepanto? Because he's the Doge. And the inscription to the right celebrates him as a new Augustus. So the Doge becomes like a sort of emperor. And these portraits lost by Titian, but still surviving in these prints, shows kind of the kind of imprinting, the kind of image that where this derives from, which is quite interesting, because then what's happening here is that Venetian sovereignty becomes a mix of various different things. And Veronese contributes to this in the way we have seen. And there is a whole rhetoric about this, the Venetians being like martyrs. And for instance, these separate images here that they're not made by Veronese, but it shows the kind of climate of the time. So this is a celebration of Marcantonio Bragadin, who was killed by flame. His king was taken away was peeled off by the Ottomans during the War of Cyprus, just before Lepanto. And his cenotaph, he's presented like Saint Bartholomew. So he becomes like a saint. And then on the right, you have an oration that was publicly recited by the official historian of the Republic of Venice, Paolo Paruta, and he celebrated the heroes of Lepanto because they were willing to die, and he describes them as new Herculeses. And it's interesting that in the frontispiece, you have an image of Venice sitting on the lions with, appearing here for the first time, a palm branch. So Venice is like a martyr. So that takes me back to where we started with Veronese. It's the last work that we'll discuss. So the hall is where the meetings of the General Assembly of the Venetian government occurred, and this is especially where the offices were appointed. Veronese's image is part of a climax of 3 allegories. The first one shows the triumph of Venice over the provinces, so sovereignty by conquest. The central one, which sounds paradoxical to us, is the spontaneous submission of the conquered provinces, which actually is grounded in the reality of the pacts between Venice and the territories. And finally, we have Venice's apotheosis, which in the program is said to represent the happiness of the Venetian subjects, the happiness that Venice gives to the subjects. In the highest parts of the painting, you have these personifications from left to right: honor, the only male figure because the term is a masculine term; peace, felicity or happiness; security, abundance, and liberty. And at the bottom, you see the joyful happiness of the Venetian people who lean from this balustrade. They appear at this terrace, and the protection guaranteed by the state. I will say a bit more about this, but let me first of all comment on this upper part. So this is a complex combination of personification and subject peoples generally, and the monumental triumphal structure that I examined before is what keeps them together. And as you can see, that gives this kind of both frontal and central and ascensional movement. So Venice is not at the center of the image, but there's a clear hierarchy. So when we see the painting, especially in the room, you can just trust me, Venice is the main focus. You can't fail that. So Venice here is presented as a matronly figure, very dignified, like a queen. She has robes like the ermine, the cloak, they're like the ducal ones, the scepter like a queen, and the crown. And she is crowned by this figure, flying victory. But that could also be easily mistaken for an angel. And this is why Thomas Crayat, an English traveler in the early 1600s, mistook her for Mary. And I think this was intentional. Veronese himself portrays the coronation of Mary early in the church of San Sebastiano, with this crown signifying her moral ascension as Queen of Heavens. And in the same church, Esther, the heroine of the Jewish people, is also dignified with a crown where, to show the distinction, her moral distinction, as the one who fought for her people. And interestingly, this is in the same church. Rubens saw it and sketched it for his own, clearly studied it and used it for his sketch of the same subject. But even more interestingly, he reused it for this other painting at Whitehall, showing the union of the crowns of England and Scotland. You can see it's just the right part is just the same. The point that Rubens captured here is elevation and how this can be used in a political context. But Veronese did this very often also with saints. For instance, Saint Justina here in Padua, you see that there is a crown actually that she's here, born by the angels. She has dropped the worldly crown. She was a princess. And the crown that is in the center again above is the crown that signifies elevation. As a saint, she's going to meet Jesus. It's just the same with Saint Catherine marrying mystically Jesus Christ, where the crown here again is the reward it's not just a reward, it really describes a transitional state. So the crown for Veronese means a transition. And when you see it above the head of Venice here, it means the transition to a state that is beyond this world. So this is, this is my point, that this is a polysemic figure that means all of these same things at the same time. Authority and virtue, divine elevation, sacrifice. And Veronese's female figures embody virtue, nobleness, queenship at the same time. And if you see the show, you will see that this is typical of his way of representing the female figure. But there is more. There is this object here. This is a crown, but this is a closed crown. So it's an imperial crown, which is not like the regal crown above. This is absolutely unprecedented, and it's the Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo the Medici, who a few years earlier wanted himself to be represented as the new Augustus with this imperial crown. So it's the imperial message transferred onto a republic, which to us sounds a bit strange, but when we wrap it up, you understand that it's not strange at all, because this is about imperial in the kind of ideal terms that I described. One final key aspect that emerges is the emphasis on the subjects, on the subject citizens. Well, the first instance, so it's the subjects here that you see on the balustrade, but if you look down, there are other people, and there are these horsemen here. This detail is quite interesting because the horseshoe is just above the heads of this woman and her son. So this knight here with a cross like a crusader, who is a Venetian knight actually, but at the same time a Christian soldier, is kind of protecting this couple, the mom and son, from these two people here that you see just in slightly hidden. The turbans indicate that these are Ottomans. And this is a reversal of an image that Veronese painted just next to this, just below. It's just to the right of this painting, where you see the defense of a Venetian town in current Albania, Scutari, against the Ottomans, where you see a Venetian woman threatened by the Ottomans. This is a reversal. This is what the imperial image of Venice means, protection for the citizens. And one final key aspect is the emphasis on the subject citizens who appear jubilant at the balustrade enclosing the terrace that opens underneath the gigantic arch. From here, they can enjoy a close view of the celestial apparition above their heads, while at the same time they dominate the ideal space that is imagined before and below them, which is also where we viewers mentally place ourselves when looking at this picture. So they are up there and we're down here. Whereas this presence was a requirement imposed by the patrons, it is Veronese's ingenious solution that created a sense of loftiness and distinction. And this image was modeled after the portrait of the lady of the house, leaning on a similar balustrade and framed by Solomonic columns in one of the most celebrated cycles that Veronese ever painted in the mainland villa of one of the most distinguished families of the Venetian elite. A portrait that evokes the presence of the lady in her house by placing her near the vault of the ceiling in a position of superiority. And there is a detail of this image in the show. I was very pleased to see exactly the same detail in one of the panels. And the reproduction of the ceiling vault projected above. So the presence of the subject in this painting marks a striking difference between Veronese and Rubens's images. In Republic of Venice, sovereignty is legitimized by the idea of good government, which the happiness of the peoples ruled by Venice demonstrates. In the absolutist context of Whitehall Palace, the subjects are not necessary, as the king's authority is sanctioned by divine approval and through dynastic continuity. Good government is assumed to just follow as a consequence, but there is no need to demonstrate it through the response of the peoples. While in Venice, divine sanction is accompanied by a justification of political actions within a Christian perspective, in England, the religious understanding of politics is harmonized with political reason. The sovereign is that whose power derives from God and is subject only to divine and natural laws, but who acts for the benefit of the state regardless of whether his or her behavior is acceptable for Christian ethics. Eventually, political reason must reconcile with the traditional concept of politics based on Christian ethics, and Rubens's images show justice, piety, and religion, as well as plenty and peace, as the housemaids of the king. In Venice, instead, self-sacrifice shows evidence of the virtuous behavior of the patriciate towards their city, their country, but also the subjects of the Republic more broadly. The Christian imperial image and its ideal of universal rule embeds Venice's sovereignty in the defense of peace, faith, and liberty. It is a matter of actual rule, Venice as imperator over her subject provinces, but also of dignity and prestige, Venice as powerful, grand, pious, generous, like the emperor. Despite these differences, Veronese invented a visual language that permeated Rubens's absolutist representation. Their paintings share the idea that there is no sovereignty without a unified dominion. James is celebrated as the unifier of the kingdoms of England, Ireland, and Scotland, while Venice rules over a body of provinces that are presented as a unified state, notwithstanding the juridical separateness between the city and the territories. On this account, Venice is depicted as independent and free, a queen that doesn't recognize any power superior to hers. Her dominion over her subject is absolute, and within her dominion equates to the rule of an emperor. She guarantees peaceful, just, and equitable government to her subjects, protecting them from external threat, like the Ottomans, that is, from tyranny of any unjust and impious ruler. And finally, Venice's rule is presented as part of a divine plan, as evidenced by the famous scene of the paradise staged on the end wall of the Great Council Hall just underneath Veronese's allegory. Though the divinization of the king is a process that gains ground in the early 17th century, the development of a visual mystique of politics in Venice paved the way for the representation of absolutist power in Rubens's paintings. It is paradoxical that what was mostly a way to relaunch the image of a republic whose actual role in the European scenario was dwindling at the end of the 16th century, feeds into the celebration of absolute monarchical power at its highest. But that image was made possible precisely because in an oligarchic republic like Venice, the idea of Venice as both the city and the polity took over the individualized composite identity of the ruling class, which became one and the same thing with the ideal government it came to embody. Within this process, the patriciate undertook also a coherent campaign of visual self-representation as a social group by portraying themselves as a cohesive political body, supporting and feeding into the idealized image of Queen Venice. The rest of the job was done by an artist whose pictorial genius we can understand only when we attentively observe the complexity of his creation. Thank you.